Why do good people die young in this world? My parents, who were always cited as examples of good people, have passed away as a result of their death. I've ended up in a difficult situation. I've become a prostitute. God, please help me escape this life. I'm exhausted. Once upon a time, there lived a girl named Stephanie. She was a cherished only child of her parents, born after many years of waiting and prayers for a child. Her birth was considered a miracle, and her parents showered her with love and care. Stephanie grew up to be an extraordinary girl, known not only for her striking beauty, but also for her kind heart. People in her community admired her so much that they would often stop and turn back to take another look at her whenever she passed by. Stephanie's parents, Mr. Edward and Mrs. Sharon, were devoted Christians and respected members of the Winners Chapel Church of God in Anambra State. They were known for their charitable acts, helping the less privileged, widows, and orphans. Mr. Edward, in particular, made sure that anyone in need of help received it, often covering more than half of support required to solve their problems. Stephanie inherited this same spirit of compassion from her parents. Growing up in a wealthy family, Stephanie wanted for nothing. She had a strong desire to help others, and this became evident during her time in secondary school. She made friends with a boy named Emmanuel, who came from a less privileged background. Recognizing his struggles, Stephanie supported him financially, ensuring he had the resources to complete his education. This act of kindness created a strong bond between them. When they finished secondary school, Emmanuel returned to his hometown of Port Harcourt to reunite with his family. Meanwhile, Stephanie stayed in Anambra, eagerly awaiting admission into the university. She had written her entrance exams and was filled with hope for the bright future ahead. But life took a sudden and tragic turn. One Sunday, after attending a Thanksgiving service at their church, Stephanie and her parents were involved in a horrific accident on their way home. The accident claimed the lives of her parents instantly, leaving Stephanie as the sole survivor. She escaped death by what many would call a miracle. The loss of her parents was a crushing blow. Stephanie was devastated. Her life, once full of love and comfort, was turned upside down in an instant. At first, many people, including family, friends, and members of their church, came forward to offer their condolences. They made grand promises to take care of Stephanie and support her education. For a while, she believed she would still have a chance to follow her dreams. However, as time passed, those promises faded away. The people who had pledged to help her slowly disappeared, one by one. Stephanie was left alone to face the harsh realities of life. With no one to turn to and no source of income, she struggled to survive. Days turned into weeks, and Stephanie found herself in a desperate situation. She went from house to house begging for food, but even that was not enough. Hunger and rejection became her daily companions. The once beloved daughter of Mr. Edward and Mrs. Sharon was now treated like a burden by the very people her parents had helped in the past. As the rejection deepened, Stephanie decided she could no longer endure the humiliation. She made the painful decision to leave Anambra State behind and seek a new beginning elsewhere. She packed her few belongings and set out for Cross River State, Nigeria. Stephanie hoped that in this new place, she would find a job and rebuild her life. As Stephanie set off on her journey to Cross River State, her heart was heavy. She felt a mix of sadness and uncertainty, clutching the small bag she had packed with a few belongings. In her pocket was only a little money, barely enough to sustain her. She boarded a shaky, old bus heading to Calabar, silently hoping that the city would bring her some sort of relief from her struggles. The journey was long and tiring. Stephanie sat quietly, staring out the window as the scenery changed. Thoughts of her past and the unknown future filled her mind. She whispered to herself, "Will I ever find peace? Will this place give me a fresh start?" When she arrived in Calabar, the city greeted her with its bustling streets, tall buildings, and loud noises. Traders called out to customers. Cars honked impatiently, and crowds seemed to move in every direction. Stephanie felt a little overwhelmed, but reminded herself, "I have to be strong. This is my chance to start over." Determined to find a job, Stephanie began her search the very next day. She walked from one store to another, asking for any kind of work. Each time she was told, "We're not hiring," or "We don't need anyone right now." Her heart sank a little more, but she didn't give up. She kept moving, her feet sore and her spirit weary. One particular day, Stephanie was so hungry she could barely think straight. She hadn't eaten all day and was starting to feel dizzy. As she wandered the streets, she came across a small cafe. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods made her stomach growl. She hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, unsure of what to expect. The cafe was warm and inviting, filled with the sound of soft chatter and the clinking of dishes. Behind the counter stood Mrs. Ada, the owner, a kind-looking woman in her late 40s. She noticed Stephanie standing at the door, looking tired and out of place. "Hello, my dear. Are you okay?" Mrs. Ada asked, her voice full of concern. Stephanie hesitated, unsure of how much to share. But something about Mrs. Ada's kind eyes made her feel safe. I'm just looking for some food," Stephanie said softly. "And maybe a job." Mrs. Ada smiled and motioned for Stephanie to sit down. "Come, sit. Let me get you something to eat first. You look like you haven't had a proper meal in days." As Stephanie ate, she began to share her story. She told Mrs. Ada about her difficult past, her struggles, and her dream of starting over in Calabar. Tears welled up in her eyes as she spoke, but Mrs. Ada listened patiently, nodding as if she understood every word. When Stephanie finished, Mrs. Ada reached across the table and held her hand. "You've been through so much, my dear, but you're here now, and that's what matters. I think I can help you. How about working here at the cafe? It's not much, but it's honest work, and you'll earn enough to get by." Stephanie's eyes widened in disbelief. "Really? You would do that for me?" Mrs. Ada nodded. "Of course. Everyone deserves a chance. But you have to promise me one thing. Work hard and don't give up on yourself." "I promise," Stephanie said, her voice shaking with gratitude. From that day on, Stephanie worked at the cafe, pouring her heart into her new job. She quickly became friends with the customers and her co-workers, who admired her determination and resilience. Though life wasn't perfect, Stephanie began to feel a sense of purpose and belonging, but her happiness was short-lived. One day, while Mrs. Ada was away, a strange man entered the cafe. He had a mysterious aura, and his eyes seemed to pierce through Stephanie. Without warning, he muttered strange words under his breath, casting a spell on her. Under his influence, Stephanie found herself searching the cafe for money and handing it over to him. When the spell wore off, Stephanie was horrified by what she had done. She burst into tears, realizing the consequences of her actions. When Mrs. Ada returned and discovered the money missing, Stephanie confessed everything. "I don't know what came over me. It was like I wasn't in control," she cried. But Mrs. Ada, furious and hurt, didn't believe her. "Stephanie, I trusted you, and this is how you repay me," she shouted before calling the police. Stephanie was arrested and thrown into jail. The experience was humiliating and painful. She had no one to turn to and often went hungry, relying on the kindness of other prisoners for scraps of food. One day, while sitting alone in her cell, Stephanie mustered the courage to speak to a police officer. She poured out her heart, telling him about her life, her struggles, and the unfortunate incident at the cafe. The officer, moved by her story, decided to help. "You don't belong here, Stephanie," he said. "I'll do what I can to get you out." When he managed to secure her release, he took her to a small hotel where she could stay temporarily. "This is just the beginning," he told her. "You're free now, but you have to decide what kind of life you want to build." Stephanie looked at him with tearful eyes. "Thank you. I won't waste this chance." As she lay on the small hotel bed that night, Stephanie whispered a silent prayer for strength. She didn't know what the future held, but she was determined to keep fighting for a better life.